A word on my recent essay, Strauss's Problem, which was provoked by my perhaps ignoble fears over the fate of Strauss after the Deneen's denouncement in the so-called debate with Munoz. Although they both denounced Strauss. I'll try to put the essay in the notes. I say one could eagerly concede to Deneen, I think, the total attitude of the practical citizen. And I think the crux of his critique is to say his teacher, Alan Bloom, who frankly was sort of a buffoonish figure in some sense, he was no philosopher. He was a mouthpiece of a philosopher or something like that. But then I don't want to go too far in the criticism of him, but I suppose he gives himself up to the final weighing of things. We see that other things could be weighed higher than Bloom, and then he appears a buffoon. And Deneen basically says, oh, well, if not Strauss himself, the results of Strauss as a teaching have been to create these two schools. One, the Bloom school, which he then associates with the false understanding of the philosopher king as understood from the Politia or the Republic. In other words, the teaching is taken then to be sort of to show the extremes, that Plato is showing the extremes, and then he's saying this is what you have to deal with, but you don't want to actually do that. And then Deneen's like, oh yeah, you don't want to actually do that. You don't want to actually, you don't want to actually treat the philosopher as though he were Socrates and put the philosopher above the state. But so what? But I mean, if we have, I mean, why is Strauss supposed to be claiming? What does that even have to do with Strauss? Well, so let's look at an alternative to that would be, say, the historical system of the three estates. Even though the philosopher wouldn't have been made the king, still, I mean, if you allow for there's some, just in a certain sense, we could transfer meaning from the priests to the philosophers, which basically was true, like in the case of German idealism, right? The philosophers were basically doing what the priests had done, in some sense. Radical mutatis mutandis, but somehow we could understand that from the point of view of looking at the positions in this practical citizen's way. Deneen is like, there's a position, the way society can be organized, where the philosopher would have a special status and be if not in that Hermann Hesse land that he plays out in the Glass Bead game. Oiselle, I think it's called. Nonetheless, I mean, the thing about Oiselle is it's more of a it's more like, it's really what it's trying to say is we're showing the peaceful, restful situation where supposedly the first Egyptian hierophants invented mathematics. So like there's certain conditions of being worry-free, where if you're in them, then the human being is going to produce a certain kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, that's the ivory tower version. And then ultimately you come to this sort of problem of should the leader know and be truly aware of what corrupt behavior is through his own being, as it were. And then if you had the perfect stainless being as the philosopher king, then yeah, maybe that would be a defect in a certain sense, because they wouldn't see the lowest, most sinister motives, of the worst elements of the brute subhuman species. So you could have this type of all types of questions like that, but I think well, first of all, that just doesn't do Strauss justice. But that's not that clear of a case. I'm just talking there in a way. But I think much more clear that Denis doesn't know the first thing about Strauss's problem is the case where he identifies very crudely and without the philologist's proficiency, and without the philologist's conscience, we should bring out moral conscience. He simply says, "Oh, mnemosony is history." So, as though there are no distinction between memory and history, as though there weren't already this word yizkor in Hebrew, and then in modern Hebrew, then in Hebrew, by the by, they brought in the Greek historia, or history, which is a totally different concept of empirical investigation, like natural history, except with dealing with documents rather than going out in a field and observing things. So it's a very specific idea, and nobody else had it but the Greeks. And then so the Strauss's difficulty is when we see that, then our philological demands become so much higher, and then the power of in the case of think of the German idealists, are all highly powerful philologists claiming to give us the real access to the text, or which is to say to what the ones who actually thought it and wrote it were doing, to give access to them, to let us talk to them. And that's important because maybe they said something's true, is the claim. Yeah, so you can't. So Denis he's just making a sophistry, but two, because that's just false. Mnemosony is not history. They're straightforwardly different things for the Greeks. Just if you just look at the semantic fields, it's obvious. The case appears so strongly that you get an immediate intuitive sense of what the differences of the two, what the two words said were. This problem of this type of problem of access, which only built up over time, as we got further away from the Greek beginning. You can't just crudely throw everything in and say, "Oh, that's the relativism, that's historicism, that's existentialism." This is a specific problem that can be isolated on its own without characterizing it as an ism. This problem of the access to the correct understanding of text, if we want to take text seriously and say, is this guy propounding the truth? That's a specific problem, and you can't say, oh, because Strauss is teaching that, he's teaching relativism, or just make these mistaken statements about how Strauss is understanding history or historical consciousness. Historical consciousness, this understanding that just this mistake that Deneen made of not seeing that the Greeks didn't think exactly the same way we did, but the concepts he saw through were different, mnemosiny and history, that again, that, Geschichte, there's another word in German, but they added Historia, they added form of the word, the Greek word, because it's a new thing, just like Hebrew did, just like English had to adopt, just like English has different word, history and memory. So not seeing that, it's just impossible to take Deneen seriously in a way. He doesn't even, there's no engagement with Strauss. He doesn't see what Strauss is doing or how it's motivated. He simply says, there's these positions like relativism, and it has something to do with forbidding one to have learned from the tradition understood as constitutive of oneself somehow. But all these things are understood in it. I mean, in other words, I just dogmatically, I'd say if Strauss were there, it's not obvious that I think there would be a ground where these problems, like Strauss would immediately point out this ground, and then it would become self-evident there's sort of a different problems are going on there. But that being said, I suppose one could say on Deneen's side, if he's really pressing the issue, it's sort of like if the fruit is poisonous, then the tree is probably poisonous. This sort of claim that every reading of Strauss has been so misguided, the Bloom reading, the Booster reading, every direction is a misguided readings, then you wonder if the source isn't bad. I think the type of reading I'm doing, I'm not the only one that reads Strauss that way, and basically I guess I would say both these guys, Deneen and Ramiro, are not really, they sort of just say, it's as though they, in the back of their mind, it's like, the Catholic system has already handled this or something, so we don't have to think about it. They act like they can just, somebody else can do it. Like it's like somebody has to do it, but the Catholic system has already handled these problems. We don't have to think about that. That's how they come off to me. Neither of them really see this problems, which are in fact also problems for the Catholic system. They merely say, there's these bad guys called the relativists or whatever, and they're attacking our system.